Hi, my name is Loren Francis, and I'm with Highview Financial Group. At Highview, we have a very keen interest in impact investing. And to be transparent, we do have an investment in the Rally Total Impact Fund. Today, we are here with Mark Foran from the Rally Total Impact Fund. And also we're here with Jeff Sear, Managing Partner from the Raven Indigenous Capital Partners Fund. I'm going to just start by asking Mark to just explain a little bit about what impact investing means and how it's different from, let's say, investing for ESG purposes.
ESG is very much a focus of looking at environmental, social, and governance factors from a risk perspective. And that risk perspective is really to shareholders. So how does the world of changes in environment and social elements impact shareholders? Now that's quite different than impact, because impact is investing with intentionality to make a positive contribution to the world, either to the climate of the world or to the social aspect. And so that is the core difference. So yes, you're looking at the impact of the world on shareholders, but you're principally also focused on what is my investment doing in terms of contribution to that world. And it is with great intentionality an impact investor would go out and seek investments that create that positive change. And of course, that would be alongside an investment return as well. We invest for impact along the UN SDGs, and we look to invest across all the SDGs rather than a specific area. So the totality of the SDGs.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the Raven Indigenous Fund and how it started and why it exists, and then we can get into some more questions on it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for having me on here. Tong Shi, Kinukinene, Indigenous, Ottawa, Donjana, just introduce you as I traditionally would introduce myself. The Raven Indigenous Impact Fund, very much follows on what Mark says. It's an impact first fund, and its intentionality is baked into everything we do, both as a fund manager and in the fund itself. Started really around 2018, and the co-founders and I, really noticed a gap in capital for Indigenous enterprises in the ecosystem, and that's really social enterprises that are high impact, really lifting up their community alongside their business and their business growth. And it's been a pretty exciting space. We originally set out to raise $5 million just to prove that an Indigenous capital provider could do the work and execute on the strategy, and ended up at a $25 million fund. What we have unearthed, I suppose, is a pretty robust innovation ecosystem in the Indigenous enterprise space, where, for example, now we have more deal flow than we do capital, which is a great problem to have, and it's a good sign of where the Indigenous economy is at. And lastly, around impact, we say at Raven, we need to see a direct line of sight between every dollar we place, every piece of capital that we place in an enterprise, and the upliftment of the community. And we really work hard to track that impact throughout everything we do. We were sector agnostic when we started the fund. We wanted to see really where's the energy in the ecosystem, but there's been clusters, natural clusters, around technology, e-commerce, tech-enabled businesses, around natural source products from the land and the sea, really in that innovation space. And as an example, I'll give you two, actual name them, Virtual Gurus out of Calgary, which is actually a digital two-sided marketplace which connects folks with skills and businesses looking, to buy blocks of time of skill. And people tend to think of this as executive assistants, but it goes way beyond that, where you can get project managers and, you can get creative people, whatever you need. And then reaching deep into both Indigenous and underserved communities to bring those people with skills forward, and then to continue to upskill through their own virtual academy, and they're doing exceptionally well now. And the second, obvious one that has a lot of profile these days is Cheekbone Beauty, which is an Indigenous entrepreneur, out of St. Catharines. Jen Harper created an innovative, completely clean Indigenous beauty line where Indigenous folks and people of color can see themselves in the product line. but also which is an extraordinarily clean product line, from packaging to every part of the element inside, the cosmetics, and a continual sort of pace of innovation at that company.
I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, some of the transformation that you've seen since you started and arrived at this point.
What seems to have occurred is that when Indigenous entrepreneurs or founders find out that there's an Indigenous capital provider on the equity side, on the venture capital side, they basically kind of emerge, heads above the water, like, there's another way to get capital besides, collateralized debt. And the mainstream financial system hasn't been spectacular at servicing these folks in the past. So there's this energy that has kind of percolated and come up. And for a lot of Indigenous entrepreneurs, venture capital really was like, unicorns and dragons. You think they might exist, but you've never seen it, in your space. So there's that. The second part, I think, at an ecosystem level, there is this broad acknowledgement that there's a bit of an untapped marketplace here, and that we may need to provide different capacity tools to go alongside that, especially financial awareness and how investment can play inside a business. On the investor side of the house, there's been way more interest that's been sparked by this, and the interest is not just coming from what I would consider mid-level investors, who invest $500,000 or $1 million, but into larger institutionals now realizing that there is a vehicle, or there are potentially vehicles where they can place capital and really have an outsized impact on the planet, on their countries where they live, and on people's daily lives. Lastly, and I know this is a bit of an odd one for folks, is what I've discovered is that, at least in my analysis, when Indigenous people control the capital and how it's placed as an intermediary in the space, it allows for a lot of innovation to occur from a financial level, where we can really decolonize the investment process. And it's been really interesting to watch investors come along with us and really be super open-minded, including where we develop our own Indigenous impact metrics framework, working on different types of deal structures that really work for Indigenous founders where they are at. What we're doing is looking at how to use traditional epistemology, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, including storytelling. We're working right with entrepreneurs inside their company as we invest in them to build out, this is how we want to measure impact. And we don't want to just count heads. We want to know how lives are getting changed bit by bit. We have a bunch of partners who we're working with. We've been spending 1.5 years birthing our impact framework and, kind of maturing it in the space. One of the big efforts that I think is going to pay off a lot is we're actually tracking it to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We feel that that's a little bit more appropriate for us in our impact measure, so we can see this direct line of sight between, for example, self-determination that you see in the UNDRIP. So in that space where we're doing much more connective work, building individual corporate placemats, building capacity within inside these new companies, largely new companies, to understand and help them understand their own impact as we go.
I think it's really important to magnify that an investment such as Raven is really about systems change. And, it really brings forward how we see, and certainly Raven sees the world as, when you create that systems change, it's truly a win-win. It becomes self-reinforcing. You open eyes. You open eyes that financial inclusion in the Indigenous community is a major issue. And you can see now that with those eyes open, you're starting to see the ripple effects.
We've had a lot of reach outs from our brothers and sisters, south of the medicine line, so in the United States, in Amazonia and in Pacifica, in particular Australia and New Zealand, with Maori-led and other Indigenous-led folks looking to do the same thing, looking to have Raven come and do the same thing. And I just returned from a large sort of business development trip in Hawaii, where Indigenous Native Hawaiians are looking at scaling what they do. And guess what? There's no Indigenous venture capital in Hawaii. So, it's just a global phenomenon. I think we'd like to, within the next sort of 7 or 8 years, have placed, $250 million of capital. So 250 million of capital between the three funds placed and growing, and building Indigenous wealth in Indigenous hands and kind of letting that have its own, secondary and tertiary impacts. I'm also leading some work within the Raven Group on if impact funds are operating at an enterprise level, there's another set of issues that need to be dealt with, and that's community level issues that are much more complex to resolve. But we think outcomes financing, so one of the social finance tools, building things, as you mentioned, Mark, like government commission outcomes contracts, social impact bonds, those sort of work. So we have 2 at play now, and we're looking at scaling that because we believe the impact is huge, both in terms of cost savings for the ecosystem, but a way to onboard private capital into working in a different way with Indigenous communities. I mean, look, to be honest, governments have been trying to solve problems in the Indigenous space for 200 years and done a really bad job of it largely. And so we think there are innovative and different ways to do that. And we think investment capital can play a strong role. Private capital can play a really strong role in shaping that.
Mark, maybe you can talk a little bit about, I know we've talked about in the past, and in terms of Jeff's comment on needing private capital to affect change. Maybe you can talk about, again, the private-public structure of the fund itself and why the importance of these types of private investments and aligning and bringing in private capital to meet largely a lot of the SDG goals, but also particularly in our Indigenous communities.
And it really is with intention beyond just the financial risk metrics of the different asset classes. The impact that's generated from, let's say, public equities or public bond investing is quite different than what we would see on the private side. So the public side is really about investing in larger organizations that are making change, and that change can be significant given their scale, but it does sometimes take a big ship a long time to turn. On the private side, what we really get, I think Jeff is really explaining this quite well, very deep systems change opportunities that are intentional, targeted, focused, and very importantly, can scale over time and really create that systems change that will be bigger in the future. So Jeff, being very modest, said that their first fund was only 25 million. Their second fund, it looks to be about 3 times that. Wow, like already, you're starting to see that change start. So those seeds can have very deep impact and ripple effects. And it's interesting that when we look at the publics, we see the commentary that those are the type of investments that they're kind of looking to make over time too. So we're at the incubation stage with the private side and very targeted, and seeing those businesses become successful that will then be able to scale either in partnership or alongside some public organizations that are looking to change. So it's quite an important piece of what we're looking to do with the fund on the private side, get those very deep intentional impacts. At Rally and many of the investment companies that we're used to, we understand the capacity of private capital, and that again, you're creating that win-win situation. And it's really important to keep in mind that when you're doing that ecosystem change, and if you look at the SDGs and some of the estimates more broadly speaking, it's 12 trillion of new global opportunities that are being created, and double that in terms of changing existing systems. So the investment opportunities from an investor standpoint are huge. So you really can generate very attractive returns and at the same time invest alongside your values to affect that systems change.
I don't think I would be alone in saying that the real key to getting to net zero, from a climate perspective, the real key to, dealing with financial exclusion and social exclusion in societies are 2 of the, really big problems that we're facing that are, one of what they call big, hairy problems that really require, creative solutions. I think actually impact investing is probably the key one of the key ways of dealing with this. And I mean, really, what are we doing with capital? And we should be putting it towards, the future. And we need to think, in my world, we need to think 3 or 4 generations ahead while we look at 3 or 4 generations back. This is what I would call 7 generation thinking from an Indigenous context. And what's the impact of our capital in 4 generations? So we need to be making different economic choices now. And, there are different choices to be made. It's not that there's an absence of vehicles and tools to do this. I believe that economies are human constructions. And if things are going sideways, like they are with the planet and freshwater and species and all these issues around climate change in particular, then we have the opportunity to remake it. And impact investing allows you to remake it very purposely. So, that's my admonition to the financial sector and to big asset holders. Be a little bit more like Raleigh, like be focused on what you actually want to achieve in your world, and that world for your children and your grandchildren. Because hoarding profits, hoarding money, in our communities used to be considered a mental illness. Your money is designed to be given away for the benefit of the community, really, right? You're to uplift everybody. So it's a bit of a more radical approach that you're used to on an investing conversation, but this is why we do the work we do, right? It's for people, it's for the planet.
That was a very informative session. Thank you both very much.